Hey guys, tonight we're heading deep into the north. Picture this. It's early winter in a Viking settlement. The sky's already bruised black by mid-afternoon. The wind is chewing through every layer of wool you bothered to throw on. And the fields are frozen hard enough to bounce a spoon. You step into a longhouse tall roof, thick beams, the air heavy with heat and smoke, and there it is. The glow, faint, orange, slightly fishy, a single candle, guttering in the corner, made from seal fat. Why would anyone render a sea mammal into mood lighting? Well, you're about to find out. And fair warning, you probably won't survive this. Not the cold, not the smell, and definitely not the charm of a world where your biggest luxury might be a wick that doesn't sputter fish oil into your soup. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're tuning in right now, drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always amazing to see where you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The longhouse smells of seal fat, wood smoke, wet wool, and onions that gave up 2 months ago. You're seated on a rough bench, sheepskin under you, your boots steaming faintly by the hearth, and in the center of it all, a squat, shallow bowl holding a grayish candle that's slowly liquefying into a puddle of flickering practicality. It's not glamorous, but it's life. Viking farmers weren't lighting candles for ambiance or Instagram aesthetics. They were lighting them because the Arctic dark was swallowing the world whole by 4 Ps, and a human soul needs at least a pinprick of flame to feel like it isn't alone. Candles, if you could call them that, were the bare minimum. Not like the stately beeswax tapers you'd find in a monastery. These were hand-packed, smelly little things made of rendered seal blubber, and whatever vaguely wick-shaped material was lying around, dried moss, strips of bark, a few brave strands of sheep hair. Lighting one wasn't a statement. It was a sigh. Something that said, okay, we made it another day. Let's not die just yet. The seal fat was the core of it. You'd have to hunt the seal, of course, drag it in from the ice, gut it, skin it, thank it maybe, and then slow boil the fat over a fire until it turned into something pourable. Or at least scoopable. It smelled memorable. Historians still argue whether this was the preferred fuel or just the most available one. Some claim it was chosen for its slow burn and high yield. Others think it was just a matter of geographic resignation because once you're living at the edge of the world, you stop being picky about what lights your dinner. The farmers didn't mind the smell. Or if they did, they hid it well. Because once that little flame was dancing, the longhouse became something else entirely. Less of a cave, more of a cocoon. The shadows stretched up the walls, turned every hanging tool into a mythic silhouette. A ladle became a dragon. A hoe looked vaguely like a sea serpent. And the rafters, they creaked just enough to make you wonder what kind of saga was sleeping above your head. A quirky detail found in a surviving saga fragment describes a farmer's daughter who refused to sleep unless a seal fat candle was lit beside her bed. She claimed it kept the bad dreams from crawling out of the thatch. No one argued. Her father doubled their seal hunts. The candles were small, but they stretched the evening. Without them, winter nights felt endless. With them, you had just enough light to knit, patch a tunic, sharpen a blade, or whisper a half-forgotten tale to whoever hadn't nodded off yet. You lean closer to the flame now. It sputters, grows, settles, and in that flicker, the walls feel closer. The cold fades back. Your breath slows. Because this isn't just a story about Viking farmers. It's a story about people trying to push back against a darkness so wide it felt like forever. And all they had was a seal, a pot, a wick made from moss, and the hope that tonight's light would last just a little longer than last night's. The seal fat candle flutters, dim but committed. It's not quite heroic, but it's doing its best in a world that wants everything cold and dark and possibly soggy. You lean back against a timber beam, shoulders hunched beneath layers of wool, and realize something. This is as warm as it's going to get, which is saying something. Because Viking longhouses weren't cozy, they were practical. Like someone tried to build comfort using only logs, smoke, and persistent denial. No insulation, no central heating, just a hearth in the middle of the floor and enough livestock huddled nearby to make you question how much of your warmth is emotional and how much is just goat proximity. And yet, Viking farmers made it work. They weren't warriors every day. Most days they were cold people with chores, and their main goal, not dying, which meant staying warm in places where the wind could slice through wool like a buttered axe. So they layered wool on wool, fur on wool, maybe a sealskin cloak if someone in the family was ambitious with a harpoon. Even their shoes were stuffed with dry grass or moss. Yes, moss again, because nothing says survival like swamp flooring in your footwear. You sit in this drafty, smoky miracle of timber and animal scent, blinking at the candle and wondering how anyone did this for years without snapping. The truth is, you couldn't rely on fire alone. The hearth was the big heat source. Yes, but it burned peat, driftwood, and anything vaguely combustible. It didn't reach the far corners. It didn't reach your feet unless you were dangerously close. And that's where the seal fat candle came in. Not to heat you, but to remind you that heat was still possible. A psychological torch in a land determined to freeze your eyebrows. And they didn't light many at once. That would be extravagant, almost scandalous. The average farmstead would ration candles carefully. One near the hearth, maybe another near the tools. A third by the loom if someone was feeling especially wild and wanted to weave after dark. Historians still argue whether candles were ever used for decoration or strictly utility. Some accounts suggest special carved holders. Others think that's just a later romanticism. Like imagining every medieval peasant sipping from a goblet and calling it vintage. You reach toward the candle and feel the warmth on your fingers. It's not much, but in a place like this, it's everything. There's something deeply human about how these people battled the dark, not with bonfires or chandeliers, but with drippy little blobs of optimism. You can imagine the ritual of it: scraping fat into a pot, melting it, choosing the wick, pouring or scooping it into a shell or carved wood bowl, watching it cool into something almost respectable. And then the lighting. A single match. No such thing. You needed embers, flint and steel, patience, prayer, maybe a well-placed curse, and finally that twitching flame. That first flicker. A win. A candle meant you'd beaten back the night for one more stretch. It gave you just enough time to patch your boots, stir your stew, mend your dignity. A quirky old tale from Iceland tells of a farmer who refused to light his candle unless he could name 5 things he'd accomplished that day. One night, he couldn't think of enough, so he sat in the dark and told himself stories instead. By morning, he'd invented 3 gods and 2 vegetables. Seal fat, of course, wasn't the only option, but it was the reliable one. Easy to store, slow to spoil, and in a land where candles weren't bought, they were boiled, strained, and cooled. Reliability was practically romantic. You blink at the longhouse around you. Smoke hangs thick near the rafters. It'll cake everything eventually, your hair, your tunic, the very air you breathe. But you don't mind, because this is warmth, Viking style, patchy, uneven, and earned. You shift slightly, tucking your hands into your sleeves, watching the candle shrink millimeter by fishy millimeter. You know it won't last forever. That's kind of the point. The candle is temporary resistance, a flickering no to a world full of night. And that's what Viking farmers knew better than most. You don't have to banish the dark. You just have to outlast it. One fish-scented, waxy, possibly soggy little flame at a time. The candle's glow wavers, its seal fat core liquefying just enough to feed the hungry little flame. You stare into it like people have always stared into small, promising fires, half hypnotized, half trying not to imagine what that smell would taste like. It's not a candle you'd find in a gift shop, more of a functional blob with dreams. And behind that flame blubber, pale, glistening, unglamorous seal blubber, the cold climate treasure no Viking farmer wanted to live without. Rendering fat became a seasonal event, like spring cleaning but with more boiling. When the hunt was successful and a seal or three was dragged up onto shore, there was celebration. Yes, but also immediate labor. Skinning, gutting, hauling. And then the part everyone pretended to enjoy the render. You picture it now, a large iron pot, set low over a fire outside the longhouse. Blubber chunks chopped roughly with bone knives, then tossed in like meaty ice cubes. The fire underneath wasn't roaring, it had to be steady. Too hot and the fat would burn. Too low and you just have a pot of sadness and regret. Steam rises, and not the clean, herbal kind, more of a nose-wrinkling marine fog. Like someone tried to cook a beach and gave up halfway. The smell stuck to clothes, to hair, to the dreams of those unfortunate enough to sleep nearby. Historians still argue whether longhouses had specific rendering days when all other activities paused to focus on fat. Some claim these days were communal, while others say each family guarded their seal pot like a secret recipe passed down in nightmares. The result, a thick, amberish liquid fat. It was scooped out, poured into molds if they had them, or just set to cool in shallow stone dishes. Over time, it would congeal into something sturdy and mildly alarming, like a waxy pat of survival. And it worked. Seal fat candles burned low and long. They didn't spit as much as tallow, didn't shrink as quickly as fish oil lamps, and most importantly, they could be made in bulk. One big rendering pot could supply weeks of light, depending on how disciplined you were about bedtime and arguments in the dark. But this wasn't just about function. There was pride in rendering well. A clean burn was the goal. Too much residue meant you hadn't skimmed properly. A flame that crackled. You left too much sinew. A candle that sputtered out midway through supper. Shame upon your house. And it wasn't just the blubber. Storage mattered. Fat went rancid if kept wrong, especially in warmer months. So it had to be sealed in horn containers, clay pots, or tucked into a hide and buried in the ground like some greasy time capsule. You imagine a farmer checking his cache before winter, digging into a cold hole and pulling out a bundle that looked less like treasure and more like a lump of vaguely judgmental pudding. But that lump could mean the difference between despair and something just north of tolerable. The ritual of lighting one was careful. They'd take a stub of cooled fat, pinch off the edge, maybe warm it near the hearth just enough to soften, then press it into a shallow stone bowl or a carved wooden dish. In the center, the wick, usually dried moss, sometimes twisted horsehair or a carefully dried stem. You wouldn't just light it and walk away. You'd watch. That first flicker mattered. A farmer might sit quietly for a few moments, shoulders hunched, hands still dirty from scraping hides, just watching the seal fat take the flame. Like he wasn't entirely sure it would work, but hoping anyway. A quirky practice mentioned in a 13th century Norse household text suggested that a family should whisper to their candle as it caught flame. Nothing poetic, just acknowledgement. Burn well, light the bread. No smoke today. Please. Some took it seriously. Others muttered it like a sarcastic prayer. You lean in, imagining your own breath catching on that first strike of flint and steel. Sparks, smoke, a few swipes, and then light. Not bright, but steady. Golden. Slightly fishy. And that moment, every time, must have felt like a rescue. Because darkness in Viking lands wasn't poetic. It was total. Black enough to forget the shape of your own hand. Cold enough to blur thought. Long enough to stretch your soul until it started making up songs. The candle, weird as it smelled, was a promise. A tiny flame in a bowl of hardened effort, rendered hope. Nightlight meets lifeline. And the best part, it was yours. Boiled by your fire. Poured by your hands. Lit because you were still here. Still fighting off the dark. Still watching it flicker. And thinking just for a moment that maybe the gods liked you enough to let this one burn clean. The wick flutters like it's nervous. You watch the flame bend sideways in the draft and then recover with the stubborn elegance of someone who refuses to fall asleep mid-sentence. This particular candle, if you could even call it that, has one crucial flaw. The wick is moss. Yes, dried moss. Sometimes charred a bit to help it catch. Sometimes braided. Sometimes just jammed in there like, good enough. Probably. Because while the seal fat was the main act, the wick was what made it a performance. And Viking farmers, they were experts at making do with what was growing, rotting, or smoldering nearby. You reach out and nudge the edge of the bowl. The liquid seal fat ripples, and the flame shivers, not out of fear, but because it knows it's only as strong as its wick. Now, picture it. You're a farmer. It's December. You've gone out earlier in the week to gather moss not for decoration, but because you need a week's worth of not dying in the dark. The moss is soaked, of course, because everything is always soaked. So you dry it near the hearth for 2 days. It turns from green to brown, then from brown to something that feels like crispy apology. You twist it, not too tight, not too loose. Then you singe the end just a bit because someone once told you that a half-burnt wick lights faster. And that sounds like something your uncle made up. But it kind of works. So you keep doing it. You place it in the center of your fat blob. Let it soak just long enough, then spark it up with flint and steel. If you're lucky, it catches. If you're really lucky, it burns straight. If you're unlucky, it flares, sputters, smokes, then dies with a hiss, like it's offended by your entire existence. Historians still argue over whether wicks were crafted deliberately or just gathered out of habit. There's evidence of moss being dried and bundled like a prized resource. But there's also writing that suggests some farmers just kept trying things until they stopped coughing from the fumes. The fringe materials are where it gets fun. There's a tale of a widow who used her husband's beard hair for a wick so he could still light her way. Sweet maybe, or slightly unhinged. Hard to say. Another farmer, famously superstitious, only used birch bark shaved by moonlight, believing it kept spirits from entering through the smoke. A quirky find from an archaeological dig in coastal Norway uncovered a wick basket, basically a pouch filled with a variety of wick materials: moss, straw, pine fiber, some sort of string, and what turned out to be goose down? Goose down. Flammable. Yes. Practical jury's out. One theory suggests it was mixed into moss to make the wick easier to light. Another suggests someone got desperate during a long winter and raided a pillow with wick-related optimism. You shake your head slightly, watching the current flame bob in its bowl. It's behaving, for now. But you know from experience that's not a promise. Seal fat candles with moss wicks had personalities. Some would burn clean and steady for hours. Others flickered like they were trying to signal passing ships. A few would burn low for a while, then suddenly blaze up, sending a puff of smoke into the rafters and igniting a short-lived family panic. One farmer reportedly called his candles moody little ghosts and insisted on lighting them with his back turned, so they don't feel watched. Lighting multiple candles in a longhouse meant coordinating wick types. Dried moss for quick light. Bark or bast fibers for longevity. Occasionally, if you were rich or knew someone who raided a monastery, you might even have a linen wick soaked in ash water. That was considered luxury. Like wearing a fur coat to bed. In summer, and here's the thing, this messy, mossy, fire hazard candle still worked. It gave just enough light to knit, to eat, to not trip over a sleeping goat. It cast a yellow-orange glow that softened the longhouse, turned creaky corners into resting spaces, and transformed every shadow into a half-remembered myth. You stare at the wick, barely more than a thread, charred at the tip, glowing slightly. It leans, straightens, and for a while it burns without complaint. It smells like fish. It smokes like an old uncle, but it glows like hope wearing a wool hat. And in this place, in this season, that's enough. The light is steady now. It's still a little smoky. Still smells like someone tried to fry a seal in an old boot. But for Viking farmers, this little flickering bowl of rendered resilience was worth more than gold, because light in winter was not a given. It was a luxury. And sometimes it was a sacrifice. You glance around the longhouse. It's dim but livable. The hearth glows low. The shadows stretch long, and that seal fat candle is doing a frankly heroic job for something made out of blubber and moss. But there's only one burning. And that's not stinginess. That's economics. Because every time you lit one of these little beasts, you were literally burning calories, not metaphorically. Like a workout. Literally, like there goes part of dinner from last week. Seal fat wasn't easy to come by, and candles weren't bought. They were made by the same tired hands that had been mending fish nets or forking hay an hour earlier. So lighting a candle wasn't just about seeing. It was about deciding how much light you could afford. Historians still argue whether candles were rationed more tightly during certain phases of the moon, or during midwinter, when food was scarcer and spirits ran thinner. Some suggest there were informal rules, one candle per family group, or only lighting during meal prep. Others say it was entirely personal, decided by mood, need, or just that creeping existential dread that sets in after 14 hours of polar night. You settle deeper into your furs, squinting as the flame flutters again. It lights your hands, your knees, the bowl of half-cooked root stew you're pretending not to resent. That's about it. Everything else remains vague, sleepy, and full of potential toe stubbing. There's no ambient glow, no bouncing light off walls, no cheerful crackling to round things out. There's just one tiny flame. And the thing is, it made everything look different. A single candle transformed the longhouse, turned practical corners into soft ones, made wood grain shimmer like gold, made people look quieter, more thoughtful. as if the shadows themselves encouraged deeper thinking or at least slower blinking. And it wasn't just aesthetics. The psychological effect of candlelight mattered, because in a place where winter stretched on forever, and snow buried your roofline, and the nearest neighbor was 2 icy fields and a grumpy ox away, having a visible flame made you feel a little less forgotten. A quirky household proverb from a 10th century Icelandic farming manual reads, "The candle sees your face when the gods do not." It sounds poetic now, but it probably came from someone muttering it at a candle while stuck indoors for the 12th day, straight with relatives who chewed too loudly. Even in wealthier homes, chieftains, landowners, professional beard braiders, the candles weren't extravagant. They might burn 2 at dinner, maybe even a 3rd near the loom. That's how you knew someone had arrived in life. They could light a candle for something besides survival. Candle math was a very real thing. How many do you have left? How many do you need to get through the week? Do you let the kids stay up and play in the light? Or do you make everyone sit in the dark like emotionally neglected potatoes until spring choices? Some families saved their best fat candles for guests. Others hoarded them for midwinter rituals. A few lived on the edge and burned them just because it felt like a Tuesday worth remembering. But for most, candles were carefully, emotionally budgeted. And that's what tonight feels like. You're here. The candle is burning. And the air smells like fish-flavored memory. But you're okay. You look across the longhouse. Someone's bent over mending a tunic. Someone else is stirring the stew. A child near the corner is tracing circles in the soot on the floor. Half dozing. They're not wasting time. They're using light. Because in Viking lands, where the dark came early and stayed for breakfast, wasting a candle was basically a felony of the soul. And yet they still lit them. Because no matter how scarce the fat, how short the wick, or how fishy the air got, no one wanted to eat in the dark. You shift on the wooden bench, your rear now slightly warmer than your knees, thanks to being somewhat within candle range, and stare into the flame like it owes you money. The seal fat candle burns low but determined, the moss wick curling inward like it's tired but committed. And for a flickering moment, you wonder what life would have smelled like if the Vikings had just chosen whale oil instead. Ah, yes, the feud. Because while seal fat candles were the everyday lighting of choice for Viking farmers, there was always that slightly smug cousin from the coast who'd walk into your longhouse and announce, "Whale oil burns brighter. You know, thanks, Bjorn. Now go slip on some moss." Seal fat versus whale oil wasn't exactly the Viking version of Pepsi versus Coke, but it was a thing. Both substances came from cold, slippery sea creatures. Both could be rendered into a thick, flammable sludge. Both could make a longhouse glow faintly less depressing. But whale oil had attitude. It burned with a hotter flame. They said brighter, some insisted, less soot. Claim the coastal dwellers, although that part might have been sheer regional propaganda. Whale oil was harder to come by. Whales, despite their size, were surprisingly tricky to kill with boats made from trees and hope. Seal fat, that was accessible, personal. You hunted the seal. You rendered the fat. You poured it into a bowl. You knew that light had come from your own 2 hands. A harpoon, and an afternoon of regretful scraping. But whale oil, that felt like imported magic. There's even a saga fragment that tells of a farmer who bragged so often about his whale oil lamps that his neighbors voted to ignore his existence for a season, which, in Viking terms, is the equivalent of being unfollowed by your entire village. Historians still argue which burned more efficiently. Some claim that whale oil created less smoke and gave off a cleaner light. Others say it smoked just as much, but with a slightly different flavor, like someone set fire to a damp cloak full of fish. You lean closer to your own candle. The flame leans with you, casting long shadows across your knuckles. The smoke curls upward, not choking exactly, but definitely present. You imagine someone showing up with a whale oil lamp right now, placing it beside yours and making passive-aggressive observations like, "Oh, that's seal fat brave. I like the atmosphere it creates. Very dense. Don't worry, my lamp smokes too when it's very windy. But there's a stubborn beauty in seal fat candles." Whale oil was often for the bigger houses, the ones closer to ports or lucky enough to have someone fall a whale near their fjord. Seal fat was the everyman's candle. It wasn't flashy, but it worked. It smelled like work, like home, like you'd earned every flicker, and there's something honest in that. A quirky tale from a fishing village tells of two brothers who spent an entire winter trying to one-up each other with lighting fuel. One used seal fat, the other whale oil. They tracked burn time, soot buildup, and even allegedly ghost visibility. No clear winner ever emerged. But the house with whale oil had to be evacuated due to a mysterious rash that turned out to be lamp smoke plus poor ventilation. So, score 1 for seal fat. You glance at your candle again. It's lower now. The wick is slumping. The fat has gone from waxy to liquid in the center, bubbling faintly around the edge like it's thinking about quitting. And yet it burns. Because seal fat, for all its downsides, was dependable. It didn't need a boatload of luck. Just effort. Just hands. Just time. The whales, magnificent as they were, required fleets, harpoons the size of your leg, and the kind of teamwork that Viking farmers frankly didn't always have energy for after a day in frozen mud. Seal hunting. It was dangerous. Yes, but doable. One man, maybe two. A spear, a prayer, a sled. And then if all went well, light, personal. Pungent, earned. Whale oil burned like a stranger's torch. But seal fat burned like something you raised from a cub. You sit back, let the flame crackle, and think maybe it's not about which candle burns brighter. Maybe it's about which one knows your name. You sit a little deeper into the bench now, spine curved, knees relaxed. The candles flicker, painting slow-motion shadows across your knuckles. The seal fat glistens like it's just barely holding together half oil, half memory. And around you, the longhouse murmurs with the low sounds of evening settling in. Because now it's not just about warmth or seeing where your soup bowl is. This is the social hour, such as it is. In a world where hanging out means sitting very still while slowly digesting root vegetables by candlelight. You glance around. The flame makes everything a little softer. Harsh lines blur. Faces look gentler. Even the thatched ceiling, which earlier felt like it might collapse just out of spite, now looks almost poetic. Like it's holding secrets instead of mildew. The seal fat candle, for all its wobbling and fishy charm, is suddenly the star of the room. It's placed strategically not in the center, but close enough to the hearth to catch the warmth, and just far enough to cast wide shadows across the walls. And that glow, it isn't just for practical tasks anymore, it's for conversation. Viking farmers weren't exactly known for their social softness, but at night, after a long day of mud, fishing, and pretending not to care about back pain, they'd finally gather. Someone might pick up a spindle. Another would scrape a hide. A third, probably the eldest in the room, might sip thick, warm beer and start talking. Not loudly, just enough to draw ears. The candle danced in the middle, turning every wrinkle gesture. and blink into theatrical lighting. This is where stories happened. Not the grand sagas carved in stone or inked by monks, but the quiet ones. The ones about what your uncle said to the goose last week. About the boy who tried to salt a fish using crushed charcoal. About the seal that escaped with someone's glove and definitely cursed it. Historians still argue about the role of seal fat candles in domestic Viking life. Were they used just for function? Or did they shape intimacy? Some anthropologists argue that their limited light actually encouraged closeness. You had to sit near each other. You had to speak softly. You had to listen because everyone's face was half shadowed and half wrapped in flicker. The result? Candlelight gossip. You imagine it now. Someone quietly whispering, "I think Ragnar's new cloak looks suspiciously like old Einar's curtain." A pause. A laugh, stifled. The candle flickers, like it's in on the joke. Another voice Thorkel says his candle sputters when he lies. It went out entirely during his last hunting story. Everyone leans in, not just because they're interested, but because the light only goes so far. And in that limited radius, truth and fiction become blurred enough to be comfortable. A quirky local tradition recorded in a coastal village suggests that a candle could be used to test honesty. If it flared or flickered wildly while someone was speaking, it meant the gods were displeased, or at least that your storytelling needed more editing. Farmers joked about flame trials, where a bad excuse could literally blow out your light. The candle's tiny halo became a stage, not just for tales, but for expressions. The flicker played across faces, made eyebrows seem more dramatic, smiles seem more secretive, and pauses more poetic. And when silence returned, the candle held it. No one needed to fill the gap. The sound of dripping wax, the hush of breathing, the occasional goat snort from the far end of the room, it all wrapped together like background music from the age of blubber. But it wasn't just storytelling and suspicious cloak talk. The candle was also there for reflection. You weren't always talking. Sometimes you were just sitting, thinking, watching the flame while your brain worked its way through a problem you didn't want to say out loud. Maybe a field that flooded too early. Maybe your neighbor's goat that mysteriously produces less milk after visiting your pasture. Maybe just why the gods made winters so long. The seal fat candle never interrupted. It just burned, softly, patiently, like it knew that not all light was for seeing. Some was for listening. And maybe that's why they stayed up so long some nights, not because they weren't tired, but because the candle hadn't gone out yet. And if the candle was still burning, maybe your thoughts weren't finished either. You look into the flame again. It's dancing now. Tired. Maybe. Or just showing off because someone laughed too loud. You smile faintly. Because in this world, the candle is your hearth, your focus, your social circle, your therapist, and your most judgmental furniture. It doesn't judge out loud. But you know, the seal fat candle has settled into a rhythm now, a quiet sizzle, a steady flame, a wobble here and there like it's thinking about quitting but keeps remembering dinner's not quite over yet. Around it, the longhouse breathes. The people are quieter. Some have nodded off in the corner, heads resting against bundles of straw. Others are still awake, squinting through the haze of the smoke curling above them, like a domesticated weather pattern. Because here's the thing Viking farmers didn't talk about, but you absolutely can't ignore. The ceiling is disgusting. It's blackened, stained, caked with soot, coated in the layers of generational smoke residue. Like someone tried to lacquer it with burnt stew and determination. You look up, eyes tracking the rise of the seal fat smoke. It doesn't vanish. It doesn't rise into nothingness. It clings, It accumulates, and over time, it changes the entire room. Viking longhouses weren't built with chimneys. That genius would come much later. Instead, they had a hole in the roof. A basic, well-meaning gap where smoke could drift out unless, of course, the wind disagreed, or the snow blocked it, or the smoke decided it liked the view and stayed. Historians still argue whether the ceiling soot was a bug or a feature. Some claim it added insulation, trapping heat and helping keep the interior just a little bit less unbearable. Others think that's romantic revisionism, and that the smoke just hung out like a roommate who doesn't pay rent but insists on DJing every night. Whatever the truth, you're now aware of it. That black smear above you isn't paint. It's your candle, multiplied by 100 yesterdays. And it builds slowly. That's the unnerving part. Every night, you burn a little seal fat. Every night. The smoke rises and sticks. It weaves into the rafters, coats the beams, gets into the thatch like it's applying for permanent residency. Eventually, it starts dripping. Yes, dripping. On warmer days, when the hearth's been roaring and the air gets humid enough, the tar-like condensation begins to bead and fall. There's a reason no one sits directly under the highest beam. That seat belongs to the soot gods. There's even a saying in Old Norse farming lore: if the roof rains, you've burned enough for two. It's meant to be comforting. It's not. A quirky passage from a Danish household record describes a guest who was politely seated beneath the shame beam, and by the end of the evening, his shoulders were blackened, his soup smoky, and his opinions permanently altered about visiting again. And yet, no one stops burning the candles, because that blackened ceiling, that's proof of survival. You've made it through winter after winter. Each stain is a receipt. Each layer of grime is a bookmark in your life's saga. It's easy to judge the filth when you have other lighting options. But in a world where the sun disappears for months and your children can't see their fingers after 3, a ceiling stain isn't a failure. It's a halo. And people got used to it. They swept the floors, washed the bowls, mended the walls, but the ceiling, that was sacred ground for soot. Occasionally someone might take a stick and poke at a sagging section. More often than not, they just nodded up at it and said, "She's holding," which is longhouse code for "please don't collapse while I'm chewing." And honestly, that dark ceiling made the candle look better. It turned the room into a theater, a small, smoky stage where light could glow instead of scatter. Shadows danced higher. Everything looked older, deeper, more mythic. You could squint at your neighbor and imagine he was a king, or a troll, or your cousin, depending on the angle. Because seal fat candlelight didn't clarify. It suggested, and in that dim, fish-scented haze, you weren't just a farmer with sore knees and smoked hair. You were part of something larger, something ancient, something that knew how to burn just enough to matter, but not so much it vanished. And that, really, is the whole Viking aesthetic. Burn slow. Burn weird. Burn with purpose. Even if the roof cries tar on your stew. The air inside the longhouse is heavier now, not oppressive. Exactly, but dense. Like it's been thickened with history, damp wool, and the dreams of onions that never made it through winter. You breathe in and realize, yes, there it is again. That unmistakable nose-wrinkling bouquet of survival smoke. Sweat, old wood, damp fur, fermented dairy, and fishy candle. You shift your legs, they stick slightly to the bench, and the seal fat candle, still bravely holding court at the center of the room, continues to release its subtle message into the air. You're alive. And also, please don't forget I'm made of seal. Because here's the truth. Everything kind of smelled like sadness and fish. The walls, the floors, the furs, the people, the air itself, all carried that particular aroma, a soft background hum of seawater and mammal oil, blended with the sour tang of effort and extremely patient hygiene routines. It wasn't a bad smell, per se. Not to them. It was normal. Just like how your grandmother's attic smells like old photo albums and cinnamon regret. A Viking longhouse had its own atmospheric identity. And seal fat candles. They were part of the brand. Even when not lit, the half-melted stubs stored in clay bowls or horn cups gave off a gentle perfume of oceanic determination. When burned, that scent spread across the room with a confidence unmatched by modern soy wax. It didn't ask for permission. It didn't apologize. It just filled the space like it paid rent. Historians still argue whether people went nose-blind to it over time. Some records suggest they did. Others hint that they simply accepted it as the cost of seeing their toes after sundown. And besides, it wasn't just the candles. Every element of Viking life added something to the grand aroma symphony. The hearth smoke clung to everything. Unwashed wool, especially when damp, smelled like something caught between compost and regret. Fermented fish, stored in barrels near the entrance, released occasional puffs of maritime reality. The floor, often a mix of packed dirt, straw, and food scraps, had its own spiritual presence. Even the animals added their notes. Cows, goats, and the occasional very opinionated chicken tucked into the far end of the longhouse for warmth and companionship. Add all that to a poorly ventilated structure in the middle of January, and you begin to understand why Viking farmers weren't morning people in the traditional sense. A quirky legend tells of a farmer who brought home a southern wife rumored to be from Francia, who fainted upon stepping inside the longhouse. Not from shock or cold, but from what she described as an atmosphere made entirely of cheese, fire, and regret. She later adjusted, reportedly, by stuffing dried mint into her nose during meals. You might think the smell was off-putting, but to those living in it, it was comforting. That fishy candle meant it was night, and someone had bothered to keep you company. That sour cheese note meant the dairy hadn't spoiled too much. That hearth smoke meant the fire was still going and the ceiling hadn't collapsed yet. Scents became placeholders for time and safety. Some families even had specific candle smells depending on the seal used, the rendering technique, or the herbs mixed into the fat. Birch bark, pine resin, a drop of dried juniper. It was a candle and a signature. Children could come home after dusk, sniff the air, and know they were in the right longhouse. There's something weirdly beautiful about that. These were not the clean, sterile candles you light to impress your book club. These were scented survival statements. You glance around the room again. No one's complaining. Someone's sharpening a blade in the corner. Another is mending a boot. A child near the door is chewing something that looks suspiciously like old leather and probably is. The smell. It just is. Not offensive. Just part of life. Because when your day involves mud, cold, smoke, and emotional warfare with frozen turnips, a little seal fat smoke isn't going to ruin the vibe. It's going to complete it. And now, as the candle leans slightly to one side, pooling its precious oil toward the lip of the bowl, you understand something that goes beyond scent or light. This smell. It's the smell of trying again tomorrow. The candle sputters just a bit. Not dramatically. It's the kind of flicker that says, "Don't worry, I'm fine. I just remembered I'm made of seal." The flame catches itself again, steadying into that golden oval of light that somehow makes everything feel older and slower and just a little softer. Your eyes shift to the wall. It's not really a wall, of course. More like upright logs with dirt between them. But it serves its purpose. It holds up the roof, keeps out the wolves, and more importantly, tonight catches the shadows. Because now the candlelight is performing again. Not for warmth, not for gossip, but for something even older story. This is the hour when the tools go quiet. The chewing slows down. And one person, usually the one who smells least like goat, starts to speak. No introduction. No clearing of the throat. Just a simple phrase. Maybe something like, "So the sea was quiet that morning." And just like that, the seal fat candle becomes a spotlight. It flickers on the speaker's face, casting wrinkles into canyons and turning every slow blink into a secret. The rest of the room, it fades into half light. Just outlines, just breathing. This is where Viking storytelling lived, not in books, not on stone, but in these tiny pools of light, where the only thing louder than the flame was the silence it made space for. The stories weren't always epic. Sometimes they were about gods and monsters, sure, but sometimes they were about a missing sheep, or a dream someone had that may or may not have involved talking turnips, or that time a man swore he saw Thor's hammer stuck in a haystack, only to realize it was a badly folded shovel. Historians still argue about the structure of Norse oral storytelling. Some say it followed formal poetic rhythms. Others say it was casual, improvised, passed like warm bread around the circle. Most agree that the setting, the low light, the seated circle, the flicker of flame was as important as the words themselves. And here's the magic: the shadows danced along with the tale. If the story involved a sea journey, the flame would lean left and right like a boat. If it was about a monster, the light would flare just enough to cast claws across the back wall made of nothing more than a shaking hand and a well-placed elbow. A quirky carving found on an old beam in a Norwegian longhouse shows what looks like a human figure with a mouth open wide and fire curling out of it. Not literal fire, but speech, drawn as smoke. Some believe it represents the speaker's flame, the belief that words held a kind of burn when told in the dark. Children would huddle close, not because they were scared necessarily, but because the edge of the firelight marked the boundary between story and whatever might be listening. It wasn't just the words that mattered, it was the gesture, the breath, the way the candle caught on a raised eyebrow or a glint of a tooth mid-laugh. You imagine yourself in that circle now, a warm bowl in your lap, the feel of wool against your knees, the smell of smoke, salt, and something that once may have been meat. And in front of you, an old man, his beard tucked into his belt, his eyes almost invisible in the firelight, telling the story of how the sun once hid beneath the sea. And it took a clever fox with a flaming tail to bring it back. You listen, mesmerized. The candle flickers when he says the word fox. It leans when he says storm. It burns low and quiet when he describes the night the stars disappeared. You look up at the ceiling, soot-streaked, silent, and you swear, just for a moment, the darkness is listening, because that's what these candles did best. They didn't just illuminate, they invited. They said, come closer, let your eyes adjust. Let your thoughts slow down. Let yourself believe just for a while that this story might be true. And when the tale ends, there's no applause. Just the soft scrape of a bowl, a stretch, a yawn, and the candle, still burning, now less of a spotlight and more of a nightlight, keeping the edges of the story warm until someone's ready to tell the next one. The seal fat candle is burning lower now, the puddle of melted blubber surrounding its mossy wick like a tiny, glistening moat of perseverance. The flame doesn't panic, it just hunches a little closer to the wick, burning with a quiet resolve, as if it knows its time is limited and wants to go out with dignity. But not yet, because tonight, someone's telling that story again. The one about the candle, the one with the awkward romance. You know the one. It starts innocently, as all Viking farm tales do. The room is dim. Everyone is half asleep or pretending to be. Someone clears their throat. No preamble, no names. Just she lit the candle and waited. And everyone leans in. Because this isn't a saga of conquest. This is the candle courtship tale. One of the few love stories passed down among a people who mostly wrote about axes, boats, and weather with a personal vendetta. Here's how it goes. There was a farmer's daughter, smart, sharp-eyed, skilled in cheese-making and judging your life choices silently across a table. She had many suitors, but none impressed her until one evening. A young man came to the longhouse, dripping with sleet, clearly having walked across 3 fjords and an emotional breakdown to get there. He had nothing. No gold, no fancy cloak, just a single seal-fat candle, wrapped in linen, pressed into her hands like an offering. Now, this was not standard romantic behavior. Giving someone a candle, especially in the depths of winter, was equivalent to saying, I thought about you. I worked for this. I rendered this blubber while thinking about how warm I want you to be. Also, it smells slightly better than usual. I swear? The girl said nothing. She took the candle, lit it. And then this is the part everyone argues about. She placed it between them on the table and just stared at him. For 2 hours. No words. Just seal fat, soft shadows, and a deeply uncomfortable level of eye contact. Historians still argue whether this story is literal or metaphorical. Some believe it was a coded ritual of proposal. Others think it was invented by someone who didn't know how to talk to women and wanted to romanticize 2 hours of social paralysis. But the candle burned clean. That's the important part. It didn't sputter, didn't smoke, didn't gutter. It burned so perfectly that the girl finally said, "You may stay until the oil is gone." And he did. Sat there the whole time, hands on his knees, pretending not to shiver or sweat. When the candle finally flickered out, she stood up, walked over, handed him a second candle, and said, "Come back tomorrow, bring a story." And he did. And they married, eventually, after 3 more candles and a minor disagreement over the best moss for wicks. A quirky variant of the tale includes the part where the man tried to carve her name into the side of the candle but misspelled it, and she roasted him for it for the next 5 winters. They still got married. But every anniversary, she made sure he told the story wrong on purpose to make herself laugh. You glance at your own candle now. It's the same kind humble, slightly lopsided, definitely not romantic by modern standards. And yet, you see it differently. Because for Viking farmers, giving a candle was giving time, giving warmth, giving something you could have used for yourself but chose instead to offer someone else. It wasn't flowers or jewelry. It was a blob of fat with a soul, and that counted for more. You wonder now, as the story winds down and the listeners exhale back into their furs, how many real courtships began this way, not with grand declarations or steamy poetry, but with the simple, "I made this, you can see by it, if you want." That was intimacy, not words, light. You watch the last of the tail curl into the shadows like smoke, and the candle flame leans toward the bowl's edge, a little tired but still game. Because love, like seal fat, is rarely neat. But when it burns clean, you remember, even 1,000 winters later. The seal-fat candle has slouched into its own puddle, the flame low, licking sideways in that way that says, "I'm not going out, I'm just thinking about it." Around the room, the conversation fades. No more stories. No more chewing. Just the occasional clink of a bowl being set down and the creak of the timber roof as it shifts in response to cold and memory. Now, it's time for the candle calculus. That delicate mental math every Viking farmer did. Night after night. How much light is left? How much night remains? And is it worth burning another wick? Or should we just give up and go to sleep with our regrets and freezing toes? You stare into the candle. It's maybe got an hour left in it, less if the wick gets moody. There's another one ready to go, sitting in a horn cup near the hearth. But lighting it means dipping into the reserve. And that means asking yourself, do I really need to see right now? Or am I just being dramatic about the dark? Welcome to light rationing. Historians still argue about how strictly Viking households measured out their candles. Some suggest there were set routines, 1 candle per night, no exceptions. Others believe it was more fluid, dictated by mood, weather, or how much fermented goat milk you'd accidentally consumed during dinner. But what's clear is this candles were counted, and not just in bowls and stubs, but in hours of light. The way a modern person checks their phone battery. Viking farmers check the depth of their fat pool and the length of their wick. It became a kind of emotional budgeting. A candle meant options. You could stay up a little longer. Sew 1 more stitch. Finish carving the spoon that's been mocking you for a week. Whisper a soft story to a sleepy child. Sit in silence with someone and not be alone. Or you could blow it out and save that hour for tomorrow. You sigh. Because that's what it came down to. How much darkness can you sit with before light feels like a necessity again? Some people were liberal with their candles, usually the optimists, or the romantics, or those who simply couldn't stand the quiet hum of night pressing in too close. These were the ones who would light a second candle just to keep talking, or thinking, or existing a little longer in visible form. Others strict, calculated, unwilling to waste a burn unless it was absolutely justified. Your uncle, for example, the one who insisted on eating in darkness because food tastes the same, whether or not you see it. He once tripped over a goat in the gloom and refused to admit it. Said the goat needed humbling. A quirky family rule recorded in a coastal farmstead near Trondheim stated that no candle may burn past the second snore, which meant the moment someone fell asleep mid-story, mid-sentence, mid-chew, you were to extinguish the flame and let night claim the rest. So people listened. They watched the room as much as the wick. Was anyone still working? Still kneading, still quietly crying into a mitten? If not, snuff it. And the snuffing wasn't just a functional act. It was a ritual. You'd lean in, lips close, breath soft, and blow not too hard, or the fat would splash, not too weak, or it would smolder annoyingly and relight like it had opinions. There was an art to it. Some used fingers, some a flat stick. Some muttered little phrases, thanks. Apologies, hopeful requests that the candle wake well tomorrow, because every extinguished light was a temporary death, and the decision to end it always carried a little weight. You sit in the half-dark now. The flame is still alive, but barely. The wick leans like it's drunk on memory. You glance at the backup candle, but your hand stays still, because tonight you're rationing the light. Not out of scarcity, but out of respect. You've gotten what you needed: a story, some warmth. A brief glimpse of the people around you turned soft and golden. Anything more would be indulgent, and Viking farmers didn't waste what was earned with effort. So you sit, let the flame shrink, and promise yourself tomorrow. You'll light the next one. If the night feels heavier, if the dark feels closer, if the story isn't finished, the room is quiet now. Not silent, but settled. The kind of quiet that grows in layers, the creak of old timber, the soft huff of a sleeping goat, the occasional sigh from someone dreaming about cabbage and mild disappointment. And at the heart of it all, the seal fat candle flickers on like a loyal old dog. Small but committed. This is when things get tense. Because now we enter the realm of candle theft. Yes, that was a thing. Seal fat candles, humble and smelly as they were, became the source of quiet drama in more than a few longhouses, especially during deep winter, when supplies ran low and people started getting creative with their definitions of sharing. You may be thinking, who would steal a half-melted blob of animal grease? Well, imagine this. It's January. You've been snowed in for a week. You're tired of the dark. You've already burned through your allotment of candles for the month. And then, tucked behind a fur pile near the hearth, you spot one. Unlit. Untouched. Technically someone else's. But does that stop you? It should. But it doesn't. Historians still argue whether candle theft was truly rampant or just exaggerated by later retellings. But household records and oral traditions from Iceland and northern Norway suggest it happened enough to inspire rules, rumors, and several awkward family dinners. It wasn't just about the light. It was about respect. That candle represented someone's hunt, someone's rendering, someone's deliberate act of fat conservation. Taking it without asking was like sneaking into their pantry and licking all their pickled fish. A quirky folk rule from the Faroe Islands goes borrow light, and you borrow luck. Steal it, and you steal sleep. The belief was that using another person's candle without permission would not only bring guilt, but restless dreams. Which makes sense. Because imagine falling asleep with your toes warm from someone else's stolen flame, only to wake at 3 a.m., convinced Odin is hovering over you, holding a ledger. In some households, they kept a separate stash not for emergencies, but just for protection. Hidden candles, tucked behind wall slats, buried in baskets under dried herbs. Some even wrapped them in old socks to mask the scent of rendered fat. Though really, masking a seal fat candle with a sock, that's like trying to hide garlic with more garlic. And of course, suspicion always circled the same people. Usually a brother-in-law, not your direct kin, just close enough to live with you, but not close enough to trust entirely. He's the one who's always just checking on the stew, or adjusting the woodpile, or making sure the goat didn't knock anything over right near where you kept your backup candle stash. You never caught him directly, but every time you lit a candle, you felt like it used to be taller, and that right there was the problem. Candle theft wasn't just about losing light, it was about losing trust, which, in the heart of winter, when the darkness is long and the hours are thick with boredom and people start to hum, just to remember they have voices, it matters. Some households got creative. They carved initials into the sides of their candles. Others added dried herbs or wax markers so if someone stole a candle and tried to claim it, they'd be caught in the act of burning someone else's time. There's even a tale of a particularly paranoid farmer who dipped his candles in soot mixed with goose droppings so that if stolen, they'd betray the thief with a very distinct aroma. Was that necessary? No. But was it Viking-level petty? Absolutely. Tonight, you look over to the stash near the hearth. Still there. 3 candles, untouched. You glance across the room. Your brother-in-law is sleeping, or pretending to, and you smile, just a little, because you know he looked, and chose not to. Or maybe he didn't find them this time. Either way, the candle you're using now, it's yours. You earned it. You rendered it, poured it, saved it, and tonight it's burning just for you. Not stolen, not shared, just enough light to make the dark feel earned, not feared. The candle burns quietly now, casting that familiar oval of orange-yellow light across your knees and the floor beyond. The wick has leaned slightly to one side, but it's still holding strong hissing every so often, like it's whispering secrets about someone else's cooking. And in the hush of the longhouse, where everything has slowed into breath and bone, the smallest sounds take on meaning. That's when you hear it. A quiet scuff, a tiny shuffle, followed by a soft, telltale sigh, the universal noise of a child trying very hard not to make noise. You don't move, but you smile, because this too is part of the candle's reach. Its light doesn't just touch the faces of the old and tired, it draws the youngest ones close. Like moths to a story they don't fully understand but know they want to hear. There she is, a small figure creeping along the dirt floor, wrapped in too many layers of wool, cheeks pink from proximity to goats and guilt. Her hair is tousled, her eyes shine, and her mission candle proximity. Not to steal it, though you'd watch her fingers just in case, but to watch it, to sit near it, to be in it. Because even at that age, she knows this light is special. It smells weird. It makes her cough if she gets too close. And it might have once dripped in her brother's homework carving, but it's still better than the cold, shapeless dark that hangs just beyond its edge. She sits, cross-legged, still, serious. She has learned the rules: children, chores, and candle discipline. Historians still argue about how early Viking children were taught to respect fire. Some records suggest that by age 5, most knew how to light a hearth, clean a wick, and render down fat under supervision. Others argue that handling candles was a privilege, not a chore granted only to those old enough not to stick a flaming stick into their neighbor's shoe. But no one disputes this candles were treated with reverence, especially by kids. A seal-fat candle was fire, warmth, power, and a little dangerous, which made it irresistible. Parents already burdened with scraping lichen off boots and arguing with sheep had to teach not just the use of candles, but the boundaries of them. Rules included: don't touch the bowl, don't breathe on the flame, don't wave things near it, especially mittens, goats, or feelings, and never, never use it to light another candle without permission. Some children learn the hard way. There's a well-loved cautionary tale about a boy named Gear who tried to sneakily light a second candle to continue carving a dragon spoon after curfew. He knocked over the first candle, set fire to his own sleeve, and was only saved by falling into a cold pot of porridge. He was fine, but forever known as Porridge Gear. A quirky family tradition from a farmstead near Sogne involved assigning one child as the candle guardian each week. Their job: sit near the flame during supper and make sure it didn't sputter, drip, or die. They were given a small spoon to adjust the wick, and if they succeeded all week, they earned the right to light the Saturday candle a bigger one, usually with thyme or dried flower petals added for special occasions. This was serious business, because the Saturday candle meant storytelling, dessert, or if you were lucky, someone reading from a carved rune plank about the time a chicken stole a hat and started a war. You glance over at the child beside your candle now. She hasn't moved, She's staring into the flame like it's explaining something only she can hear. Maybe it is, because this right here is how memory gets passed. Not through lectures, not through scrolls, through ritual, through the quiet act of watching something burn and understanding, even without language, that it matters. The flame dances on the bowl's edge. She leans closer. You're about to warn her when she whispers, very softly. It's smaller than it was. And there it is. The lesson. Candles shrink. Time passes. Light gets used, and the only way to honor it is to notice. You reach over, gently, not to scold, just to adjust the wick, so it burns a little cleaner. She watches you, takes it all in. Someday, she'll do the same. She'll carve her own spoons by this light, cook her own stew, tell her own stories, and teach someone smaller than her how to breathe gently around the flame. The child has drifted off now, curled beside the hearth like a little lump of wool in sleep. Her head leans just enough to suggest she put up a solid fight but was ultimately defeated by warmth and flicker. The seal fat candle continues its vigil, low and steady, like an old sentry who's seen too many winters to get excited about one more. And tonight, unlike most nights, it isn't just burning for chores or stories or mildly accusatory side-eye over who stole the last turnip. Tonight, it's burning for ritual. Because every now and then, even the most practical of Viking farmers remembered that light wasn't just for sight, it was for spirit. There were rare moments when the candle was elevated literally and figuratively to serve something bigger than stew and bedtime. It sat at the center of ceremonies, marked changes in seasons, honored births, marriages, and the very occasional peaceful goat. But most importantly, it burned for the dead. Not in big, dramatic funerals with incense and choral backing, though that would have been something. No, these were quiet rituals, done in the corners of the longhouse or out by a stone, lit with calloused hands and no witnesses. Just a flame, just a whisper, just a night where someone decided it was time to remember. Historians still argue whether these moments were widespread or deeply personal. Some suggest certain nights like the winter solstice were designated for ancestral lights. Others say it was up to the individual when the grief crept in, when the silence got too big, when the dark began to feel too crowded. That's when the ritual candle came out. Made with better fat? Maybe? Or with a specific moss wick that burned blue at the edges. Some were scented with crushed juniper or dried mint. Others were shaped into small animals or carved with runes no one would explain. Tonight, you see someone reach for one. They don't announce it. They just move quietly across the room, unwrap a small bundle, and set the candle in a niche by the wall. It's round, unmarked, smooth. The wick is twisted tightly, soaked a little longer than usual. When it lights, the flame rises cleaner, taller, less sputtering, more purpose. It smells faintly of cedar. You don't ask who it's for? You don't have to. Because when these candles are lit, everyone just knows. Someone's being remembered. Not loudly, not with speeches, just with light. The kind of light that says you were here, you mattered, you still do. A quirky bit of folklore says that if the flame flutters 3 times in quick succession, the spirit is pleased. If it leans left, it's listening. If it leans right, it's leaving. Tonight, the candle holds steady, which, depending on who you ask, means the spirit just wants to sit a while and not be bothered. You respect that. Because in a place like this where darkness is a daily neighbor and every moment of light is earned rituals matter, they create pause. They mark the difference between surviving and meaning. And even the most hardened farmer, the kind who traps squirrels with eyebrow movements and can fix a roof with a spoon, still needs to believe that light can do more than just keep you from stepping on a rake. It can connect you to the past, to the people who aren't here, to the parts of yourself that you only visit when everything else is quiet. You watch the candle burn. No one speaks. Even the goats are quiet, like they know. And for a few long moments, the longhouse feels less like a structure and more like a vessel floating gently through time, carried on seal fat and memory. Eventually, someone stands, walks over, cups their hand gently around the flame, and breathes. It goes out with a soft sigh, like it was never really there to begin with, but the smoke lingers. So does the warmth. So does the feeling that someone came back for a little while. And now they've gone. The candle is wrapped again, returned to its bundle, stored away. But its job is done, and you sit, watching the other flame still flicker in its bowl, and think light, when used like this, isn't a tool. It's a language. And tonight, it said everything without needing to speak at all. The night deepens, stretching itself thin across the beams of the longhouse. Shadows pull back. Candlelight softens, and the air grows still as if even the wind outside has chosen to stop and listen. You shift, careful not to wake the child beside you, and glance at the seal fat candle. It's tired now, flickering low, but still holding the room. This is when the gods arrive. Not loudly, not with thunder or fanfare, but with flickers. Because in the dark, when the chores are done and the mouths have quieted, the candle becomes something else an altar. A thread between the everyday and the ever after. A doorway. Vikings believed in many gods, but more than that, they believed in signs. And when you only have a bowl of seal fat and a wick made from moss, every pop, sputter, or lean of the flame becomes a message. Was it Odin, blinking at you through the smoke? Was that crackle Freya, giggling into your dreams? Or maybe it was just a breeze. But what if it wasn't? Historians still argue over how much of Norse spirituality actually happened in grand temples versus longhouses like this over bowls of bubbling oil and flickering shadows. And honestly, the answer might be both. Because when the winter's long and the gods feel far away, sometimes all it takes is a wobble in the flame to feel seen. Tonight, someone begins to hum. It's not a tune. Exactly more of a tone. A slow, droning note that wraps itself around the room like a second layer of wool. Low, warm, ancient. Others join in, one by one, until the longhouse is filled with something that feels both sleepy and sacred. The candle listens. It flares once, holds, then dims again, like it's acknowledging the hymn. And then someone begins to speak not loudly, but with that same rhythmic cadence. A whisper that rides the breath more than the voice. They came in the smoke and stood at the edge. And you know this story, not because you've heard it before, but because it lives in the bones of every farmer who's ever watched a flame burn strange in the quiet. This is the story of the flickering gods. The ones who show up when your body is too tired to believe, but your eyes can't look away from the light. According to old tradition, certain candles burned God straight, no sway, no lean, no change. Others flickered and flared and danced, as if invisible fingers were playing with the flame. If your candle burned God straight during prayer, you were heard. If it flared during confession, they were amused. If it sputtered and died, try again tomorrow. A quirky rune poem carved into the back wall of a long-abandoned farmhouse reads, Flame tall, God's call, flame low, truth slow, Flame split. Spirits sit. No one knows who carved it, or when, or whether it was meant as poetry or instructions. But it's been copied into a dozen folk tales since. Because the seal fat candle wasn't just fire. It was divination. No bones to throw. No tea leaves to read. Just fat and wick and the way it moved in the dark. Some farmers swore the gods didn't want offerings, they wanted company. So you'd light a candle, set it near the center of the room, and just sit, not beg, not chant. Just be there. Maybe light a second one. Maybe offer a bit of bread. Maybe whisper into the bowl as the fat melted and hope the smoke carried your worries somewhere better. And sometimes if you were lucky, something in the flame would nod back. Tonight, that same sense hums around you. Someone coughs softly. Another stretches and yawns. But the energy is still there. Not dramatic. Just present. You look into the flame. It bends slightly to the left, then steadies. You don't know what that means, but you feel better. Because whether it's Odin, Freya, a bored ancestor with a sense of timing, or just the wind, something is with you. And that's enough. The candle crackles softly, a final snap of fat, maybe a goodbye, and the gods, whoever they are tonight, lean back into the smoke. Not gone, just no longer visible. Because they know, as you do, the dark is never just empty. Not with the flame, not with the story, not with a little fish-smelling light trying its best. You wake for a moment not fully, just that drifting edge between dreams and breath. And the first thing you notice is the absence of light. The seal fat candle is gone, burned down to nothing. Its tiny puddle of waxy ash cooled in its bowl like the last sigh of something that tried very hard and has finally earned a nap. There's no smoke, just the memory of warmth hanging faint in the air, like a song that stopped mid-note. You don't panic. You listen. The longhouse is quiet, breathing, not asleep, exactly just settled into its deeper rhythm. A rhythm that only happens after the last candle has burned out and everyone agrees not to mention it. But one figure moves. A tall one. Quiet. You barely open your eyes, but you see him, the old farmer. Stooped, wrapped in 3 layers of wool and one of pride. He's walking with purpose, but not toward the hearth. No, he's heading toward the midwinter stash. The secret pile. The hoard of hidden grease. Because every household had one. A small reserve of fat, not for cooking, not for emergencies, not even for the gods. This stash was personal, hidden behind a loose board or under a stone, tucked in a waxed pouch or a horn cap. It was the fat you saved for when you couldn't take the dark anymore. Historians still argue about whether this was a widespread practice or just a habit picked up by those who knew better than to trust group candle math. But stories of hidden seal blubber abound. Fat stores found under floorboards, marked with initials, or tied with cords soaked in herbs to keep away rats and maybe siblings. You watch the farmer bend low. He moves aside a pot, slides out a small wooden box, and opens it. Inside, one squat candle, lumpy, slightly crooked, but carefully poured. Its wick is twisted moss, darker than usual, and embedded near the base a bead. Glass, blue, imperfect. This is no ordinary candle. This is a ritual of one. Not for ceremony, not for company. This candle is for the kind of night when the dark gets too close, when your thoughts get too loud, and when no other light will do. You close your eyes as he lights it. The strike of flint is soft. The first flare is small, but the light that follows whole. It fills the corner like an apology, softens the air, stretches toward the ceiling as if it, too, wants to remind the rafters that they're still supported. The farmer doesn't speak. He just sits beside it, cross-legged, hands folded in his lap. He's not working, not praying, just being. Because sometimes that's what the midwinter stash is for. Not for need, for permission. To feel the weight of the season. To sit with the dark instead of fighting it. To burn something small that reminds you you're allowed to want a little beauty. Even when the stew is gray and the roof leaks tar and your best coat smells like goat feet. A quirky bit of folklore from the Lofoten Islands tells of a woman who made one secret candle each year, embedded with a bit of colored thread. She'd only light it if she hadn't laughed by the 12th week of winter. It was her way of remembering brightness inside the flame, inside herself. Tonight, the old man's candle does something similar. The light doesn't reach far, but it reaches enough. A few nearby faces glow. The corners of the room reappear. A wooden spoon on the floor looks suddenly poetic. You roll onto your side, the child beside you twitching in her sleep. You breathe in. You smell seal fat. Yes, but also something quieter. Hope. Not loud, not heroic, not guaranteed. Just there. Sitting in the dark with you. Telling you that even in a longhouse full of snoring and soot, someone saved something warm just in case you needed it. And tonight, maybe you do. So you sleep again, wrapped in wool and whisper, while the secret candle burns, not for the room, but for the soul. When you wake again, it's not because of a noise. It's the change in the air, a soft hush. Like the night has taken one long, deep breath and is holding it just long enough for you to notice. The secret candle is still burning. Barely. Its flame is low, hovering just above the rim of its bowl like it's unsure whether to carry on or finally rest. The wax around it is nearly gone. The bead inside, remember that little blue bead has caught the light, refracting it in the tiniest splash of color against the wall. It's beautiful. In a way only something humble and nearly over can be. And now, with the room quiet and still, you begin to feel it again. The strange tension that always lingered around these little candles, especially the ones made from seal fat. The odd reverence for the seal. Because here's the secret. Viking farmers rarely said out loud they respected the seals, feared them. Even, not in the way you'd fear a bear, or the ocean, or your mother's disapproval, but in the way you fear something familiar and mysterious at the same time. Seals weren't just meat. They weren't just fat, or fur, or something to make boots out of when the cows weren't cooperating. They were something else. Something that lived between worlds. Historians still argue about the role seals played in Norse mythology and ritual. Some accounts suggest they were seen as messengers. Others believe they were simply convenient sea beasts. But dig a little deeper, and you start to find stories, whispers, carvings, poems that suggest the Vikings saw more in those eyes than just blubber. Because seals looked at you. Really looked. They'd pop up through a hole in the ice, blink those big glassy eyes, and stare in silence as if judging you for everything you were about to do with their cousin's thigh meat. There are tales of Selkies, seal people who shed their skins and walk the land in human form, sometimes falling in love, sometimes vanishing without warning. Those stories didn't come out of nowhere. They came from this strange intimacy the farmers had with the creature they hunted, rendered, and yes, burned. And that made the candles feel a little haunted. Not spooky haunted, soul haunted. You couldn't burn seal fat without remembering where it came from. Without thinking about that moment, the animal had looked at you, as if to say, "Are you sure this is how you want to spend your evening?" And so, the candle wasn't just light, it was a witness, a quiet companion, A tiny, flickering piece of a creature that once moved through dark water, breathed salt, sang in storms, and now sat on your table, illuminating your stewed parsnips and internal dilemmas. A quirky practice found in Greenlandic Norse settlements involved whispering thanks into the smoke of a newly lit seal fat candle. Just a word. Nothing dramatic. Bless. Light. Forgive. No one explained why. They just did it. And if they forgot, the wick might sputter, or the fat might burn unevenly. Coincidence, of course. Definitely. You watch your own candle now. It leans, hisses, catches itself again. That bead in the wax glimmers once more, then goes dull as the flame pulls away from it. And suddenly, you feel a strange urge to say something. Not to anyone else, not even to the room. Just to the candle. To the seal. So you whisper not loudly, not solemnly, just softly, like a thought you're letting out before it gets too heavy to carry. Thank you. And somehow, that feels right. Because you didn't make this candle. Someone else did. Someone who scraped and boiled and stirred and poured. All so you could sit here and feel a little less alone. Someone took a piece of the sea and turned it into a flicker that's been keeping your thoughts warm for over an hour now. And now it's almost gone. You exhale. The candle wobbles. One last shimmer. One last quiet breath. Then dark. Not all at once. Not jarringly. Just a slow fade. Like the end of a song you didn't realize was playing. And now the room holds that special kind of silence that only comes after something old and important has just left. No one moves. No one speaks. But you all feel it. The seal is gone. The flame is done. The gift has been given. And the dark is back. Not as a threat. Just as a reminder that every light you're given, no matter how strange, or smoky, or slightly fish-scented, is worth sitting with. Because sometimes light comes from unexpected places, and sometimes it comes at great cost. The darkness is complete now. Thick, like fur. Soft in some places. Scratchy in others. It wraps around the longhouse without asking. Without need for permission. Because the last flame has flickered out, and no one dares strike another, not yet. This is the moment Viking farmers knew well, the hour when night has no rival. The shadows are no longer playful. They've settled into themselves. The ceiling is just an idea above you, no longer visible. The only light left is the faint memory of where the candle used to be, like an afterimage on the backs of your eyelids. This is when the last candle of the year was lit. Not tonight. Not this exact night. But soon, near the end of winter, before the thaw, when spirits were at their lowest and stories thinned out into sighs and repetition, a tradition emerged half-spoken, half-feared, the lighting of the last seal-fat candle in the household. Because no matter how careful you were, how strict your rationing, or how many candles you pretended not to light on moody Thursdays eventually, you ran out. And the final candle that wasn't just wax and wick, it was a moment, a turning point. Historians still argue about whether this tradition had any consistent ritual across households. Some say it was always done at the new moon before the spring melt. Others claim it happened at random whenever the candle count hit 0. But what's agreed upon is this lighting the final candle was never casual. It was an event. It often happened in silence. The candle, usually stashed away from view, was brought out by the eldest person in the house. They would hold it in their palms for a moment, as if weighing the winter itself. Some kissed it. Some blessed it. Some stared at it like it might answer questions they hadn't figured out how to ask yet. And then, finally, they lit it. The last candle. One wick. One bowl. One more night of seal fat light to hold back a world full of cold. You imagine it now. The room drawn closer than ever. People pressing in not for heat, but for togetherness. This light is shared, more than any other, because this is all you've got left. No backups, no hordes, no last-minute wicks made from questionable moss in the neighbor's beard. Just this. A quirky superstition from the Svalbard settlements claimed that if the last candle burned unevenly, the coming spring would be late. If it cracked loudly midway through, it meant a child in the house would get married before the next winter. If it smoked, it meant someone had forgotten something important. And if it went out early, you lit nothing else. You sat in the dark and waited, because trying to replace the last candle was said to bring bad luck not just to the house, but to the village. It was like pretending you hadn't been warned, like arguing with the end of something that had already been generous enough. So they watched it, the way you're watching yours now in your mind's eye. The glow so familiar yet so final. It lights faces like a memory. Hands reach out not to touch it, but to catch the warmth before it vanishes. No one talks, but everyone thinks the same thing. This light is different, not because it's brighter, but because it's borrowed. From the year, from the sea, from the seals, from the gods. And when it ends, because it always ends, no one complains. They just sit a little longer, let their eyes adjust, and accept the dark. Because after this you begin again. You wait for spring, for light that comes from the sky instead of a bowl, for warmth that doesn't smell like marine mammal and stubbornness. But until then, you remember this flame, the last one, the one that taught you how to see everything you needed to see before everything went dark. There's no flame now, only the dark and the strange, glowing quiet it leaves behind. You sit with it. Everyone does. There's no rush to relight. No scramble to melt more fat. Trim a new wick. Dig out another cracked bowl. It's as if the whole longhouse agrees, without speaking, that this moment deserves to last just a little longer. The candle is out, but what it gave you still lingers. This is the part Viking farmers rarely spoke of directly, but surely felt the afterglow of seal fat light. That subtle moment when your eyes haven't quite adjusted to the dark again, and your thoughts are moving slower, soothed by the echo of something that used to be warm. It's like the silence is thicker now, not heavier, just deeper, like a blanket that remembers every night it ever covered. You breathe in, and even without the flame, the air carries its memory. The scent of smoke and salt and survival, the whisper of stories told in low voices, the warmth of hands stitched with work, reaching for bowls, children, and the edge of a fraying curtain. Seal fat candles were never meant to be impressive. They weren't grand. They didn't sparkle. They didn't illuminate the world. They just did enough. Enough to let you stitch, eat, talk, laugh. Enough to help you see just far enough forward to believe tomorrow might actually arrive. And for a people who lived with 1 foot in the snow and 1 hand on a spear, enough was a kind of miracle. Even the candles that smoked too much, the ones that sputtered halfway through a story, the ones that exploded because someone stored them next to the rye, even those, they mattered. Historians still argue whether Viking lighting techniques were primitive or simply adapted to circumstance. But they tend to miss the most important point. This light wasn't about brightness. It was about belonging. About knowing that someone, somewhere, had worked to make sure the dark wouldn't have the last word that night. The seal, unwilling participant though it may have been, became part of that effort. Its fat became fire. Its fire became company. Its company became memory. And now the candle is gone. But your mind glows. You remember the warmth it gave your fingers, the shadow it cast over the carved spoon, The way it flickered when the gods were near, the soft crackle when someone confessed too much, the time it was offered as a gift, and the room held its breath. And now, with the longhouse folded around you like a slow exhale, you let that memory be enough. Because here, at the end of the night, after all the fat and moss-related arguments, after the stories and sighs and seal-eyed guilt, you are still here, still breathing, still part of a long line of people who kept the dark at bay with whatever they had, even if it was just a puddle of grease and the faintest flicker of flame. Because that was all it took. To turn night into space, to turn cold into comfort, to turn survival into story. And now, you sleep. Not because the light is gone, but because it stayed long enough to carry you here. Let everything soften now. The stories, the shadows, the flame that lived and flickered and finally gave way to the hush. Let your breath slow as the last memories of seal fat warmth drift upward, dissolving into the rafters like old smoke. You are wrapped in dark, but it's not empty. It holds the shape of all that came before. The quiet voices around the hearth, the soft eyes of a child watching the flame, the nod of a goat in the corner, bored but content. The candle, now gone, left something behind, a kind of echo in the room, a rhythm, the knowledge that the light doesn't need to be bright to be enough. It just needs to be there. And tonight it was. Let the scent of the longhouse drift past soft smoke, old wool, something vaguely aquatic, and let it pull you deeper into rest. Let the walls disappear. Let the cold stay outside. Let the dark around you hold you like a memory. You are safe. You are still. You are in the dark. But the dark is not alone, because the seal burned for you. And now, its work is done. The house sleeps. The night hums. And you, warm and slow and far from everything that asks too much of you, drift gently into the kind of sleep that only comes when someone else held the light for long enough to let you go. Good night.